Hi, my name is Mike Piatek-Jimenez, and today I'm going to be reviewing the Canon 50mm f1.8 STM. So this lens is actually a very popular lens because people usually buy it right after buying a digital SLR. It's kind of like their first lens that they upgrade to or add to their kit. And there's a good reason for that. It's a really high quality lens with really nice image quality, and it's not that expensive. It costs a little bit over $100, and so it's one of Canon's cheaper lenses in their lineup. Now, the other benefit to this lens that a lot of people appreciate is that on a crop sensor camera, it's a very good portrait lens. On the crop sensor, it puts it out at about an 80mm equivalent, and that just is a nice range if you're taking head and shoulder shots if you're close up, or if you step back a little bit, you can still get full body portraits of people, and it's just a good range to be at. It makes people look good, and if you have a lens that, if you're taking pictures of people and you have a lens that makes people look good, you're gonna like the pictures a whole lot more. So I'm coming from the perspective of upgrading from the last version of this lens. I had the 50mm f1.8 and I had that lens for several years, and about 6 months ago I traded in to buy one of these. And so I kind of had an idea of what to expect. The lenses are very similar, but the differences blew me away, and it turned into being a much bigger upgrade than I was originally expecting. So let's talk a little bit about image quality. When this lens is wide open at f1.8, you're going to get kind of a soft, dreamy look to it. The center is sharp, but the corners of it are kind of more blurred, and this is expected out of a less expensive lens. You're not going to get sharpness all across the frame, especially at a wide aperture like that, without putting a lot of glass in there and making a lens that's much more expensive. On the other hand, though, you really don't have to stop down a lot to really get a good benefit out of the 1.8. And so if you stop down to say 2.8, you're good. 2.8 on up, it's really tack sharp, corner to corner, and the quality of the image you get out of it is really quite amazing for a lens of this price. So I wanted to give you some real world examples of what this lens looks like at different apertures. With this first set of images, I wanted to show the sharpness between the center of the frame and the corner of the frame. And so here, this is at f1.8, it's focused on the front of the train, and you can see it's actually quite sharp, a very usable image. And so if you keep your subject in the center of the frame at f1.8, you're going to get a nice result. But if you look then at the next image, I repositioned or reframed it so the train was in the corner, and then I refocused it on the train in the corner, so the focus should be accurate. And you can tell here it's just not nearly as sharp as the center of the frame. Let me see if I can pull up a direct comparison here. Again, you can see on the left hand side this is in the corner of the frame, and it's just not nearly as sharp as the center of the frame is here in the photo on the right. This next set of images that I wanted to show you would kind of put the subject, fill the frame with the subject a little bit more, and so it kind of goes edge to edge, and I try to keep it on the same focal plane, so you can get a rough idea of how much it sharpens up as you stop down the aperture. So here again, this one was taken at f1.8, and you can tell, I mean, in the center of the frame, it's really quite good. But as you move over to the edges, it definitely softens up, especially on the far edges here. So let's see what the difference is between this image and the next one that was taken at f2.8. At f2.8, you can tell it sharpens up in the corners quite a bit, and not only that, but the vignetting is much more apparent at f1.8 than f2.8, where you have these darker corners on the f1.8 version, and then if you snap to the f2.8, it actually sharpens up across most of the frame, and as well, like the vignetting almost goes away. And if you go one more stop at f4, it's even better. I mean, here it's really quite sharp, and the vignetting is non-existent to my eyes. I also wanted to point out these highlights in the background. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the new lens has a 7-bladed aperture, or 7 aperture blades, and they're all rounded, and so it actually the background highlights are quite nice looking on this lens. The other difference that I noticed is the focusing on it. Now the focusing is an STM motor, which is really good in some ways and not in others. For video it's very good because it focuses very quietly and very smoothly. And so if you're capturing video, you're not going to hear a focus motor whirring around or buzzing in your movie because it's doing that all very quietly. The drawback though is that when you're taking still photos and you want to do manual exposure or manual focusing, it's kind of a focus by wire system. And so when you turn the focusing ring, it doesn't turn or adjust the focus at the same rate all the time. It's kind of has an acceleration curve to it, and so it can be kind of difficult to focus manually on it. If you do find yourself doing that a lot, then that's something that you might want to keep in mind. I ended up using it for astrophotography, and it ended up being okay. I mean, I would be focusing in live view to get the stars sharp. But it really it was more of a hassle to do than a lens that has a focus ring that's directly attached. So, but like I said, in video focusing, it's really kind of smooth, it's silent, and it just looks very good. So, I wanted to give you a better idea of how loud the lens is while focusing. And also just how quickly and smoothly it focuses while capturing video. And so here's some pans to trigger some focusing so you can get an idea. So now let's compare it a little bit to the previous lens, the 50mm f1.8 II. Like I said before, it has a lot of the same elements. The optical elements of the two lenses are identical or very close to being the same. But there are some key differences here that make this new lens, the image quality on it, just a step above. The biggest difference I found was actually the aperture blades. The old lens had 5 aperture blades that weren't rounded, and so when you took an image and you looked at the background, you would have these highlights that would kind of get blurred out as pentagons, and it looked distracting to me. I didn't really care for it much. This new lens has 7 aperture blades, and they're all rounded aperture blades beyond that, so the background highlights actually come in much smoother. They're more circular, they're smooth, they're not as distracting, and just more beautiful of a background when you're taking portraits. Or any other image for that matter. It brings your attention back to the main subject of your image. The other difference in the optical quality of the lens is actually in the lens coatings. On the front of the glass and on the other inner lens elements, that Canon adds separate coatings, and so what this does is it reduces flare in your image. There was definitely quite a few images I took with the old lens where flare distracted from the image, and not just solar flare, but even from bright lights in a frame if you're using in the evening. And there were quite a few times that I took an image that the flare just ruined it. There was so distracting in the image, and it was in a place that I couldn't easily correct for it in Lightroom afterwards. And so I really was kind of disappointed in that. This new lens doesn't have as much a problem with flare. It really handles it much better. And so if you have a 50mm f1.8 II and the flare is bugging you in some of the images you're getting from that, then this lens will definitely improve in that situation. It's also a lot better built than the old lens was. I mean, it has a very much like a a powder coat finish. It just has some texture to it that makes it feel less plastic, even though it is still plastic. And just overall, like the switches on it are pretty solid. The focus ring, even though, I mean, it's a focus by wire, it really turns very nice and smoothly, and so it feels just like a more expensive lens than it really is. And one of the big differences is that the new lens actually comes with a metal mount. The old lens had a plastic mount, which just doesn't feel as sturdy, and so when you put this one on your camera, it feels very solid, and there really has a higher quality feel to it. And so that's kind of the breakdown of the differences between this new lens and the old 50mm f1.8. Now, when I was going to purchase this lens, I also compared it to the next model up in Canon's line, the 50mm f1.4, and so there are some differences there, and I ended up deciding on this lens over that, and for the following reasons. And I have to step back and say this disclaimer: I didn't actually have any physical contact with the 50mm f1.4. I haven't used it on my camera before, but I read enough reviews to kind of get the gist of how it behaved. And so here's kind of what I observed. For one thing, it's a couple $100 more expensive. It comes in at just over $300 instead of $100. It's still not a very expensive lens, but that is something to consider. The sharpness between the two lenses are very similar. You're not going to get much of a sharpness improvement on the f1.4. The benefit you get is being able to open up the lens 2 stops more to f1.4. Which is something that this lens can't do, obviously. Now, the image quality at those apertures on the lens is much more the same, the dreamy look that you get at f1.8 on this lens. So that's something to consider if you're looking for something that's going to be tack sharp at f1.4. The more expensive 50mm is not going to give you what you're looking for. You're going to have to step all the way up to the 50mm f1.2. But there were some benefits of the 1.4, and one of those is that it has a USM focusing motor. Now, it doesn't have the newest ring type USM focusing motor that the newer lenses have, and so it's not quite as fast as those, but it's certainly faster than the STM focusing motor on this lens. And so when you're doing stills, if you're doing more action shots or something, the 1.4 is going to focus more quickly for you and lock in that much faster. On the flip side of that, though, if you do a lot of video, then you're going to want the focusing motor on this lens, because the STM just focuses much more smoothly and quietly while you're recording video. The other thing that with the USM is that it does, when you're doing video, it makes little bits of noise. You'll hear these little clicks. They're very subtle, but with the STM lens, you don't hear that. And so they are both silent when focusing, but the USM is just a little bit louder when you're recording video. So if you need that extra 2/3 of a stop of light, if you're shooting in dark conditions where you really need that extra light, you're going to be using it at 1.4 all the time, then by all means go and get the 50mm f1.4. I'm sure you'll love it. But otherwise, if you don't think you're going to be using that or that aperture too often, then by all means get the 1.8 STM, and gives you 95% of the performance for 1/3 of the cost. So that's a good way to go. Now, if you wanted to compare it all the way up to the 50mm f1.2, I mean, there's really no comparison there. The 50mm f1.2 lens is a $1,300 lens, and this is $100. I mean, you could buy this and break it 10 times and still be paying less than what you would do for one of those lenses. Image quality of that one is much better. I mean, you're going to have the L style, more saturated colors, and it is going to be sharper below f2, and the background, the bokeh in the background is going to be so much softer for it. And so there's definitely a reason that lens costs a lot of money, and you also pay for it by it's a lot heavier of a lens too. But overall, I mean, I would suggest that if you're getting paid for photography, if you're an event photographer or doing weddings or any other kind of event where you really want the tools that are going to be reliable and give you the absolute best image quality, then go for the 51.2. But otherwise, it's hard to recommend it over something like this that's so inexpensive and can really surprise people when they're looking at images. So yeah, overall, it's a really a good lens for the money, especially, and a good lens in general. I mean, there's lenses that I've paid a lot more money for that don't have the same image quality as something like this. And so for that reason, I give it a high recommendation. I think it is a great lens to get, especially if you're getting started, but even if you've had time to collect more lenses in your kit and you're just looking for a middle range 50mm focal length, then it's really it's hard to go wrong with something like this lens here. Again, my name is Piatek-Jimenez, and thanks for watching.